Something just happened in the Middle East that most people completely missed. Not a missile strike, not a military confrontation, not another round of diplomatic threats exchanged across the Persian Gulf. What just happened is quieter than that. And because of that, it is far more dangerous for Iran than anything a warship or an air force could ever do. The United Arab Emirates just made a move, a calculated, deliberate, surgical move, and it went straight for the one thing Iran has spent decades building, protecting, and depending on more than anything else in its entire geopolitical arsenal. Not its nuclear program, not its proxy militias, not its missile stockpiles. Something far more critical than all of those combined. And the moment this move was finalized, people inside Tehran's power structure understood something terrifying. They cannot fix this. They cannot rebuild it. They cannot replace it. Not in 5 years, not in 10, maybe not ever. What you're about to hear explains why Iran's worst nightmare was never a military strike. It was always this. Stay with me, because the story goes much deeper than the headlines. To understand what just happened, you need to go back and understand something that most outsiders never fully grasp about Iran's survival strategy. Iran has been under some of the most severe economic sanctions in modern history. American sanctions, European sanctions, United Nations restrictions, financial blockades that were designed to suffocate the Iranian economy and force its government to change course. And yet, somehow Iran survived. Somehow Iranian oil kept moving. Iranian money kept flowing. Iranian goods kept entering and leaving the country. Iranian businessmen kept conducting international transactions. The regime kept paying its proxies across the region. The nuclear program kept receiving critical components. How does a country under that level of pressure keep functioning? The answer is one city. One single, gleaming, extraordinary city sitting on the southern coast of the Persian Gulf. Dubai. For decades, Dubai was Iran's secret weapon. Iran's back door to the global economy. Iran's invisible lifeline running underneath every sanctions regime the West ever constructed. And it was all happening right in plain sight. Think about the geography for a moment. The United Arab Emirates and Iran are not distant rivals separated by vast oceans. They are neighbors separated by a body of water you can cross in a few hours. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz, which UAE and Iran both border, is barely 39 kilometers wide. You could almost see one country from the other on a clear day. For Iran, this proximity was not just a geographical fact. It was a strategic lifeline, a permanent escape hatch built into the landscape of the Middle East itself. And Iranian leaders understood this from the very beginning. When American sanctions began tightening in the late 1970s, Iranian businesses started migrating operations, not to countries that openly supported them, not to Russia or China, at least not initially. They migrated to Dubai, to Sharjah, to the free zones and trade corridors of the UAE. Why? Because Dubai was asking almost no questions. The UAE was building itself into a global trading hub. It wanted commerce, it wanted business, it wanted money flowing through its ports and banking systems. And Iranian traders brought exactly that. What grew over the following 4 decades was something extraordinary, something that quietly became one of the most important financial networks on the planet. By the time the most severe sanctions waves hit Iran in the 2010s, an entire shadow economy had been constructed inside the UAE. Thousands of Iranian-owned front companies registered in Dubai's free zones. Iranian businessmen holding UAE residency permits, moving between Tehran and Dubai on a weekly basis. Gold trading operations, currency exchange networks, import and export businesses, all set up specifically to route around Western financial restrictions. Iranian oil did not always move as Iranian oil. Sometimes it moved as Iraqi oil. Sometimes it appeared in shipping records as petroleum products from unnamed sources. The tankers would go dark, disabling their tracking systems as they crossed the Gulf before reappearing in UAE waters with new paperwork and new destinations. Iranian money did not always move as Iranian money. It moved through layers of shell companies, through gold purchases, through real estate transactions in Dubai's booming property market, through cryptocurrency networks, through hawala systems that left almost no paper trail at all. The scale of this was staggering. At its peak, estimates suggested that hundreds of billions of dollars in Iranian economic activity was being processed through UAE-based networks every single year. The UAE was not just a backdoor for Iran, it was the door, the hallway, the entire building through which Iran connected to the global economy. Iran could survive American military pressure. It could survive Israeli airstrikes on its proxies. It could survive diplomatic isolation. But without Dubai, without that financial corridor running through the UAE, the Islamic Republic, as it currently exists, would face an existential economic crisis unlike anything it had ever experienced before. And Iranian leaders knew this. They knew it deeply. They understood that Dubai was not just useful. Dubai was irreplaceable. That is what made it the crown jewel. But what happened next changed everything. The first tremors of this shift came with something that surprised the entire world. something that, at the time, many people dismissed as a symbolic diplomatic gesture with limited real-world consequences: the Abraham Accords. In 2020, the UAE normalized relations with Israel, a peace deal brokered by the United States that brought two of the most strategically important countries in the Middle East into open diplomatic and economic partnership. For most people watching the news, this looked like a positive but relatively contained development. Trade would increase, tourism would flow, technology partnerships would emerge. What most people did not realize is that buried inside that deal, invisible in the headlines, was something that Iran should have been terrified about from the very first moment. Israel has one of the most sophisticated intelligence and financial tracking operations on the planet. Mossad, Unit 8200, and Israel's financial intelligence capabilities are in a completely different league from most agencies in the world. These institutions had spent decades meticulously mapping Iranian financial networks. They knew the front companies, they knew the shell corporations, they knew the trading routes, the banking relationships, the gold dealers, the currency exchange operators. They had files, deep, detailed, comprehensive files on the entire architecture of Iran's sanctions evasion infrastructure operating inside the UAE. And now, for the first time, Israel and UAE were partners. The intelligence sharing began quietly, professionally, without fanfare. And inside UAE financial institutions, something started happening that had never happened before. Banks began receiving lists. Compliance officers began getting briefings. Regulatory bodies began issuing new directives. The Financial Intelligence Unit of the UAE started operating with a level of precision and depth of knowledge that its Iranian targets found deeply alarming. Accounts were flagged, transactions were blocked, companies were reviewed, audited, and in many cases shut down. For a while, Iran tried to adapt. It always does. The front company that got identified would be dissolved and replaced by two new ones. The trading route that got flagged would be rerouted through a different free zone. The bank account that got frozen would be replaced by accounts in different institutions. Iran is patient. Iran is experienced. Iran has been running this game for 4 decades. They knew how to evolve, but something was different this time. And it took a while for them to understand exactly what had changed. The intelligence was not coming from random tips or occasional financial audits. It was systematic. It was continuous. And it seemed to be improving over time rather than fading away, because the source of the intelligence was not going anywhere. This is where things take a serious turn. The UAE made a strategic decision, a decision that went far beyond the Abraham Accords and far beyond any single political moment. The UAE decided to change what kind of country it wanted to be. For decades, Dubai's model was essentially built on asking few questions. Volume was the priority. Transaction flow was the priority. Being the most convenient hub in the region was the priority. And that model worked. It turned a desert emirate into one of the wealthiest cities on earth. But that model also came with a cost. It put UAE on gray lists compiled by the Financial Action Task Force, the international body that monitors money laundering and financial crime. It attracted increasing scrutiny from the United States Treasury. It complicated UAE's relationships with Western financial institutions that did not want their correspondent banking relationships tainted by association. The crown jewel that was saving Iran was also quietly becoming a liability for the UAE itself. And Emirati leadership, which is extraordinarily pragmatic and forward-thinking, looked at the landscape and made a calculation. A cold, clear-eyed calculation. The future of UAE as a global financial center depended on being credible, on being trusted, on being the kind of place that Western banks, American institutions, European investors, and global corporations could operate in without fear of regulatory contamination. That future was incompatible with continuing to serve as Iran's economic escape hatch. The crackdown that followed was not announced with fanfare. It was methodical. The UAE overhauled its entire anti-money laundering regulatory framework. New laws, new enforcement mechanisms, new penalties, new international cooperation agreements, compliance requirements that suddenly became genuinely demanding rather than performative. The Financial Action Task Force removed UAE from its gray list in 2024, a significant milestone that reflected real, substantive change in how the country was operating. Getting off that list required demonstrating actual enforcement, actual prosecutions, actual institutional reform. And in delivering on those requirements, UAE systematically dismantled the infrastructure that Iran had spent 40 years constructing. The free zones that had been virtually unregulated became subject to the same scrutiny as the mainland. Shell companies without genuine business operations began facing mandatory dissolution. Bank accounts tied to suspicious transaction patterns were frozen or closed. Trade finance operations routing goods through UAE for sanctioned destinations were shut down. Gold traders who had been moving Iranian wealth in the form of bullion across the Gulf found their operations under investigation. Real estate transactions used to park Iranian money in Dubai's property market face new ownership transparency requirements that expose the beneficial owners behind layers of corporate structures. The Hawala networks, those informal money transfer systems that had been Iran's invisible financial arteries, suddenly found themselves under unprecedented scrutiny from both UAE regulators and international intelligence agencies working in coordination. What most people don't realize is that the destruction of this network was not just about cutting off money flows in the present. It was about destroying the institutional knowledge, the trusted relationships, the operational infrastructure that Iran had taken 40 years to build. Think about what it takes to construct a functional shadow economy inside a foreign country. You need people, experienced operators who understand how to structure transactions, which banks ask the fewest questions, which regulatory environments have the softest enforcement, which document trails can be constructed to withstand scrutiny. You need relationships. Trust built over years with local partners, with traders, with banking officials, with logistics providers. Trust that is earned slowly and cannot be manufactured overnight. You need cover. Legitimate businesses, genuine trade flows, real commercial operations that provide plausible context for the financial transactions flowing underneath them. And you need time. Years and years of operating in a relatively permissive environment where you can refine your methods, fix your mistakes, and continuously improve your operational security. Iran had all of this in the UAE. It had built all of this slowly and carefully over 4 decades, and it is almost entirely gone now. The question that matters, the question that Iranian strategists are wrestling with right now, is whether this can be reconstructed somewhere else. And the answer, when you look at it honestly, is devastating for Tehran. There is nowhere else. There is no other city in the world that combines the geographic proximity to Iran, the established trade infrastructure, the international banking connections, the logistics capacity, and the historical openness to Iranian business that Dubai provided for 4 decades. Oman borders Iran and has historically maintained decent relations with Tehran. But Oman's economy and banking system are a fraction of the UAE's scale. Moving through Oman, what used to move through Dubai would be like trying to push a river through a garden hose. Iraq shares a land border with Iran and has deep economic and political connections to Tehran. And yes, Iran does significant business through Iraq. But Iraq's banking system is deeply fragmented, heavily watched by American advisors embedded throughout its financial institutions, and unable to provide the kind of sophisticated international trade finance that Iranian businesses need to connect to global markets. Turkey is further away, has a more complex political relationship with Iran, and has its own reasons to be cautious about allowing its banking system to become a primary conduit for Iranian sanctions evasion, particularly given its aspirations for closer Western economic integration. China has been increasing its trade with Iran. Russia has become a more important economic partner, but neither Beijing nor Moscow can provide what Dubai provided, which was access to the dollar-denominated global financial system, access to Western trade finance, access to the international shipping and logistics networks that move the majority of global commerce. That is what was unique about Dubai. It was not just a nearby city. It was a nearby city that was plugged into the global financial system in a way that allowed Iran to secretly plug in alongside it. There is no replacement for that, not anywhere on the map. Now pause for a moment and consider what this means strategically. Iran has invested enormous resources in its military deterrence strategy, missiles, drones, proxy forces across Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, a nuclear program that keeps its adversaries uncertain and cautious. All of these instruments of power cost money. All of them require supply chains that run through the international economy. All of them depend, at some level, on Iran's ability to access global financial networks to fund, supply, and sustain them. The proxy network alone costs Iran an estimated $1 to $2 billion per year. The missile program requires imported components. The drone program that made Iranian weapons globally notorious depended on access to foreign-sourced electronics and materials. Where did the money come from? In large part, from oil revenues that move through UAE-based networks. Where did the components come from? In large part from trading companies operating out of Dubai's free zones that sourced materials from international suppliers. Squeeze that network, and you are not just hitting Iran's economy in the abstract. You are squeezing the circulatory system of Iran's entire regional power projection strategy. You are hitting everything. But there is another dimension to this that goes even deeper. Something that makes this situation even more consequential for the long term. Iran's ability to maintain domestic legitimacy has always depended, at least partially, on its ability to deliver some level of economic functionality to its population. The Iranian government has a compact with its citizens that goes something like this. We may restrict your freedoms. We may demand ideological conformity. We may confront the entire Western world on your behalf. But in exchange, the country will function. People will be able to earn money, conduct business, access goods from the outside world. That compact has been under enormous strain for years. The Iranian rial has lost catastrophic value. Inflation has made basic goods unaffordable for millions of families. Unemployment among young Iranians is severe. The brain drain, the exodus of educated, skilled Iranians seeking better lives elsewhere, has been relentless. The social contract is fraying. And it has been fraying precisely because the economic lifeline running through Dubai has been steadily constricting. When that lifeline is decisively cut, when the escape valve that allowed at least some economic pressure to be released is sealed shut, what happens to the pressure? It has nowhere to go. This is where the geopolitical implications become truly profound. Iranian leaders are not blind to this dynamic. They understand it. And it creates a terrible dilemma for them. On one hand, the pressure created by the loss of the Dubai corridor pushes toward some form of accommodation with the West. A nuclear deal, a grand bargain. Some agreement that would result in sanctions relief and renewed access to the global financial system. From a pure economic survival standpoint, this is the rational response. On the other hand, accommodation requires compromise. It requires accepting limits on the nuclear program that the hardline factions of the Iranian government have spent decades framing as a matter of national sovereignty and existential necessity. It requires making concessions that, inside Iran's domestic political environment, could be portrayed as surrender. And Iran's leadership structure is not monolithic. There are factions that would benefit from a deal and factions whose entire power base depends on continued confrontation with the West. The Revolutionary Guards, in particular, have enormous financial interests in the sanctions evasion economy itself. They are among the primary operators of the very networks that are now being dismantled. Those factions will not go quietly. They will resist accommodation. They will find ways to sabotage negotiations. They will manufacture crises, they always do, to poison diplomatic atmospheres at critical moments. Iran is trapped between an economic reality that demands change and a political reality that resists it. And that trap is getting tighter every month. Now consider what this means for the UAE itself, because this story has a remarkable second dimension. By destroying Iran's financial lifeline, the UAE did not just damage Iran, it transformed itself. Think about what the UAE has accomplished in the space of just a few years. It has moved from being a country on international financial gray lists to being a credible, trusted global financial center. It has positioned itself as an indispensable partner for Western nations trying to apply economic pressure on Iran, Russia, and other sanctioned entities. It has deepened its relationship with the United States to a degree that provides it with security guarantees and strategic protection that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. And it has done all of this while simultaneously building extraordinary economic relationships with the rest of the world. With India, which is now one of the UAE's largest trading partners. With China, with whom the UAE maintains pragmatic economic ties. With Africa, where Emirati investment and infrastructure are rapidly expanding. The UAE has positioned itself as the Switzerland of the 21st century Middle East, a neutral, reliable, professionally regulated hub that serves global commerce without becoming a liability for the global financial system. That positioning is extraordinarily valuable. It is, in its own way, a strategic masterpiece, and it came at Iran's direct expense. But we are not done yet, because there is a final layer to this story that ties everything together and explains why what just happened is not just a current event, but a historical turning point. Iran built its regional strategy on a foundation of economic resilience. The theory was that no matter what pressure the West applied, Iran could survive it. It could adapt. It could find alternative routes, alternative partners, alternative systems. This theory has driven Iranian foreign policy for decades. It is the reason Iran never fully capitulated under sanctions. It is the reason Iranian leaders consistently rejected Western demands that they considered excessive. They believed, based on experience, that they could outlast the pressure. The Dubai corridor was the empirical proof of this theory. Every time the West tightened sanctions, Iran found a way to route around them through Dubai. Every time one channel was closed, 3 new ones opened. And because Iran could point to this survival as evidence, its leadership maintained credibility with both its own population and its regional allies. Look, they could say, they tried to crush us for 40 years, and we are still here. We are stronger than their sanctions. We are smarter than their restrictions. We will endure. That narrative is now in serious trouble. Because if the Dubai corridor is truly gone, if the primary mechanism by which Iran demonstrated its economic resilience has been shut down, then the empirical foundation of that narrative begins to crumble. And narratives in geopolitics are not just stories. They are sources of power. They are what keep alliances together, what keep populations loyal, what keep adversaries cautious. A narrative of resilience that can no longer point to actual resilience is not a narrative. It is a vulnerability. The reverberations of this are already being felt across the region. Iran's proxy partners, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi movement in Yemen, various militia groups in Iraq and Syria, all of these actors depend on Iranian financial support to maintain their operational capacity. When that support begins to compress because Tehran's own revenues are under pressure, choices have to be made. Who gets funded? Who gets cut back? Which operations are maintained and which are allowed to atrophy? These are not hypothetical questions. They're being asked in budget meetings in Tehran right now. The proxy network that Iran spent decades building as its primary tool of regional influence is only as strong as the financial foundation underneath it, and that foundation is cracking. In Lebanon, Hezbollah is already experiencing financial strain. In Yemen, the Houthi campaign, which briefly appeared to be Iran's greatest recent success in using proxies to reshape regional dynamics, is costly to maintain. In Iraq, the carefully cultivated network of Iranian-aligned militias requires constant financial attention. Iran is being asked to fund more with less, and the less keeps getting smaller. Here is what the coming months will tell us. If Iran moves towards serious diplomatic engagement, if the tone from Tehran shifts toward accommodation and the openings that have existed in nuclear negotiations are genuinely pursued, it will be at least partially because the economic pressure created by the loss of the Dubai corridor is becoming impossible to ignore. If Iran moves in the opposite direction, toward escalation, toward confrontation, toward provocative actions designed to demonstrate that it cannot be cornered, it will be because the hardline factions have decided that economic collapse is preferable to political humiliation. Both scenarios carry profound risks. Both scenarios will shape the Middle East for years to come. And at the center of both scenarios, invisible to most observers but absolutely central to the strategic picture, is the decision that the UAE made. The decision to close the door that Iran had kept open for 40 years. What makes this moment historically significant is not just the immediate impact on Iran, it is what it demonstrates about the nature of power in the modern world. We live in an era where financial warfare has become as important as military warfare, where sanctions, compliance systems, banking networks, and trade finance are weapons as consequential as missiles and drones. Iran built its strategy around military deterrence and economic resilience. It invested in weapons that could threaten its neighbors and the global oil supply. It invested in proxies that could project force across the region. It invested in a nuclear program that forced its adversaries to think twice before pushing too hard. But it neglected something. It neglected the vulnerability of the economic architecture underneath all of those military and political investments. It left that architecture, that irreplaceable network built over 4 decades in Dubai, exposed, concentrated in one location, dependent on the continued tolerance of a host country that ultimately had its own interests to serve. And when that host country changed its calculation, when UAE decided that its own future required a different kind of partnership with the global financial system, the entire structure collapsed. There is a lesson here that extends far beyond the Iranian case. In an interconnected global economy, economic choke points are often more decisive than military ones. The ability to cut off access to financial systems, to banking networks, to trade finance, to the infrastructure of global commerce can accomplish what armies cannot. This is not a new idea, but the Iran-UAE story is perhaps its clearest contemporary illustration. A country that spent enormous resources on missiles, drones, and proxy armies found itself more vulnerable to the decisions of a neighboring financial hub than to any military threat it had prepared for. The crown jewel was never a weapons system. It was a city, a network, a set of relationships built over decades that allowed Iran to breathe under the pressure of unprecedented sanctions. And now that jewel is gone, Tehran can adapt in many ways. It always has. It is a regime with extraordinary experience navigating adversity. It has survived revolutions, wars, assassinations of its top commanders, sabotage of its nuclear facilities, currency collapses, and popular uprisings. Do not underestimate Iran's capacity for resilience. That would be a mistake. But what Tehran cannot do is replace what it lost in Dubai. Not quickly, not completely, not in any way that restores the functionality and the scale of what existed there. The geographic reality cannot be changed. There is only one Persian Gulf. There is only one city sitting at its heart with the infrastructure, the banking connections, and the international credibility that Dubai possesses. The historical reality cannot be undone. The relationships, the operational networks, the trusted partners who made the Dubai corridor function were built over 40 years. They cannot be reconstructed in 4. And the geopolitical reality has shifted. The Abraham Accords, the UAE-Israel intelligence partnership, the American pressure on Gulf states to tighten financial compliance, the FATF requirements, and the UAE's own strategic decision about what kind of country it wants to be. All of these forces are pointing in the same direction. That door is closed, and it is not opening again. This is the moment that future historians may look back on as the beginning of a new phase in Iran's story. Not a military defeat, not a dramatic confrontation, not a moment of obvious crisis that made headlines around the world. Something quieter, something more structural, something that happened in compliance offices and regulatory briefings and intelligence sharing sessions and banking audits. the slow, methodical, patient dismantling of the one thing Iran could never afford to lose. And now, as Iran looks out at a world where its primary economic escape route is sealed, where its proxy network is under financial pressure, where its domestic economy is continuing to deteriorate, and where its primary adversaries are more aligned than at any point in decades, the question facing Tehran is one of the most consequential geopolitical questions of our time. What does a cornered Iran do next? That answer will define the Middle East for the decade ahead, and whatever that answer turns out to be, it begins here, with a single decision made not in a war room or a weapons factory or a diplomatic summit, but in the gleaming financial towers of a city on the Persian Gulf that decided it no longer wanted to be Iran's secret. Crown jewel is gone, and nothing will ever be the same.